Hello. So today I want to talk about how to avoid gluten and choose gluten-free food options. And we've already spoken about who might want to consider avoiding gluten and why. And we took a deep dive to see what gluten does in the body and how it can affect our gut and specifically our immune system. So now, arguably, the most important part is how to put this into action. So, where to find gluten and how to choose gluten-free options if that's something that feels good to you in the next steps in your healing journey. So, where to avoid gluten, where is gluten, and where do we find it? I think a lot of times people first get confused with this whole idea of grains, like which grains contain gluten and which don't, because for a really long time we've heard whole grains. Whole grains are so good for you. Everything's about whole grains, like heart healthy whole grains. And so I think the confusion comes in with thinking, okay, well, which grains are good for you and which grains contain gluten and which grains should I avoid? And there's a little bit of miscommunication here. So I want to start out just by talking about whole grains. So when we look at grains, overarching, there's kind of an umbrella here, grains, and you can think of two things branching off, and there's whole grains and there's refined grains. And the whole grains are just grains that haven't been changed from their original composition much. They use the whole grain. So when manufacturing whole grains, use the entire seed in its most natural form and don't discard any parts of it. And so products that are labeled as whole grains can also be made by using a flour of whole grains that's created by grinding down parts of the seed. So it's the whole grain. And the refined grains are just that they've been processed a bit from their original state. So we can think there's under grains, there's two umbrellas like that. But if we're looking more at the whole grain umbrella, what's going on in there? There's two more little pieces that come out at the bottom there. And I'm going to make a chart of this. Currently, I'm like air drawing the chart with my fingers, but I'll make a chart too, so it's a little bit clearer. And there's grains, whole grains that contain gluten and whole grains that are gluten-free. And so I think that just being able to kind of see that overarching picture of grains helps a little bit. So some of these gluten-containing grains are wheat. We know that one. So different varieties of wheat or different names of wheat that we'll hear are spelt, farro, durum, and products like bulgur or semolina. So you've probably seen some of those in pastas and breads and things that usually contain wheat, that we know contain wheat. Other ones are barley and rye. So those are some of the main gluten-containing whole grains. So then there's the non-gluten containing whole grains, which include rice, amaranth, buckwheat, which was very confusing to me because it literally has wheat in the name, but it's a gluten-free grain. Millet, quinoa, some of the ancient grains like teff, sorghum, and oats. So the ones you probably hear or use and see most frequently are rice, quinoa, and oats. That's typically what my clients will be eating more of. But the other ones are great bring in too if your grains are working well for you. It all kind of depends. So oats too, I should mention, this kind of brings me into another topic about gluten. They're inherently a gluten-free grain, but because of the way they are manufactured and processed and stored, a lot of times they can have cross-contamination, which just means that a gluten-free product has come into contact with a gluten-containing product. So when you're buying oats specifically, you want to buy certified gluten-free oats so you know that they are gluten-free. Cross-contamination can happen where we're not exactly sure how someone has manufactured or produced or stored a gluten-free product. So sometimes we just don't totally know. To voluntarily label a product gluten-free in the US, it must contain less than a certain amount of gluten, which is mandated by the FDA. But if a product is not labeled gluten-free, but you don't see any gluten-containing ingredients listed, it doesn't mean that the gluten is underneath that amount, amount that has to be mandated. That's basically what it means, is they just can't put that label on it. And usually it's due to how they are processed, where it's processed, and if there's a risk of cross-contamination. So that's just kind of something to think about too, depending on how sensitive you are to gluten and really just knowing where you're getting it from. I know a lot of times at Trader Joe's recently I see products that used to be labeled gluten-free that have all gluten-free ingredients. They no longer have that label, and I'm imagining it's because of this specific rule. So just something to think about there. Cross-contamination can happen also in our own home, in our own kitchen. So if you use a toaster or like a cutting board, and you're cutting gluten-containing bread, and then right after that you're cutting gluten-free bread, that's cross-contamination as well. And so just something to think about there. Even when we think we're getting in gluten-free things, that's just one other thing to think about. Other sources of gluten, because I know a lot of times when I'll be talking with clients and they're like, well, I'm avoiding gluten, but I'm sure there's all these sneaky things that are getting in that I don't even know. And gluten is in things that we wouldn't expect it to be, but it's not in everything, so don't worry. But some things that you may find gluten in are medications, supplements, beauty products. So things like that that we're putting on our skin or ingesting, you want to just have a look at the label and see if you find gluten or any of those gluten-containing names, kind of like sneakier names for gluten. Other foods that we may not expect it to be in are things like soy sauce, different sauces that can have it in there, salad dressings, I see it sometimes, spice mixtures that contain gluten as an anti-caking agent can be in there as well. So again, as always, being a conscious consumer, you just want to know what the heck's in your food anyways. So making a habit of always reading labels and looking at what all of the ingredients are. So that being said, you're probably like, oh my gosh, I can never eat anything ever again or walk outside my house because I'm going to get gluten. And that's not true. And I know at first it can kind of feel like that. But if we are just eating a real whole food diet, meaning we're getting in lots of good veggies, we're getting in good fruits, good quality proteins, good fats, and nuts and seeds and oils and all of these things, we're not consuming gluten on a daily basis. So always going back to the basics and just really thinking of eating real whole foods and how can we get this nutrient density into us. And we don't even really then have to worry too much about getting in gluten-containing things because we know we're putting all this good food in our body. So I say just start there, like start simple with the big things that we kind of know that are gluten containing, and that's like bagels and pastas and breads and all of these more obvious sources of gluten. As you start to kind of wrap your head around that and feel good around that, then you can continue to be a conscious consumer and see where you might be getting gluten in other areas of your life. So I like to just start there and just keep it really simple. I'm going to attach a meal plan for you guys. That's a 7-day meal plan that has some inspiration for recipes and how you could do batch cooking, plan out your week. And all the recipes are gluten-free. They're actually, I think most of them are gluten and dairy-free. And so you can just use that to accommodate to your needs and use it as a guide. So that hopefully will be helpful for you as a good place to start. If you have any other questions, especially about how to get started, what to think about, and where you might be getting in sneaky sources of gluten that you're not sure, don't hesitate to ask the questions in the comments here or send me an email at info@christinatidwell.com. And I hope this was helpful in the third part and how to actually put these things that we're learning into practice. Thanks.